Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all today. Before going ahead with the proceedings, if you'll join me in Gasho. Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be back at another Pacific seminar after 7 years. I'm grateful for the invitation extended by the Centre for Buddhist Education and the Jodo Shinshu International Office to attend this event and to share with you my thoughts on the important subject of orthodoxy. I admit to some trepidation in tackling such a delicate topic. After all, trying to uphold certain teachings in a manner considered correct is sure to be regarded as controversial. Even so, the consequences of failing to defend our traditional doctrines are so dire that one feels duty-bound to speak up so as to stave off the demise, while still possible, of an invaluable spiritual heritage which sadly, at least from where I see it sometimes, appears to now be on its last legs. The term orthodox comprises the Greek words orthos, that which is right, true or straight, and doxa, meaning view, belief or opinion. This strictly corresponds to the Buddhist notion of samyak drishti, or right view, the first step of the Noble Eightfold Path. And what exactly is this, asks the Buddha. He replies that it's knowledge of the origin of suffering and knowledge of the cessation of suffering. Notice here that we are not being asked to give credence to any dogmatic propositions. Rather, the Buddha is pointing to a particular kind of awakening that discloses the truth of our lives. This, of course, also has vital implications for a correct appreciation of Jodo Shinshu. As you well know, a widespread concern among leaders of the Sangha is our diminishing congregations. This has been an ongoing problem for some time, but there appears to be genuine puzzlement regarding the cause. Yet, if current trends continue, our tradition risks becoming an empty shell, a quaint cultural artifact that no longer speaks to us. Once a teaching is deprived of its spiritual impact, people no longer know what to do with it. So it's admired from a distance as a nicely decorated corpse that's been drained of all vitality. In his renowned poem, The Second Coming, written in the aftermath of the First World War, the great Irish poet William Butler Yeats described a time of acute anxiety and disorientation. He writes, "Things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." This evocative description aptly captures something of our present age of bewilderment, especially in relation to values and principles. Let's see then if we can identify the problem that we are facing right now, with a view to proposing what might well be the only durable remedy. So what is the objective of a spiritual teaching? Is it simply to give us a moral code to live by, so that we can all get along without antagonism or disagreements? Many people believe that this is indeed the purpose of religion, to help make the course of our existence run as smoothly as possible by accepting approved beliefs and by observing sanctioned behaviours. However, The Buddhist tradition has a deeper problem in mind that it seeks to resolve. Hornen states it beautifully and with great pathos as follows. He says, "The blossom that opens in the morning is scattered by the evening breeze, and the dew condensed in hours of darkness before dawn is dispelled by the rays of the morning sun. Heedless or willfully ignorant of this procession of changes, we dream of prosperity all through life, and without understanding the nature of transience, hope for longevity. All the while, across the face of the earth moves the restless wind of impermanence, dissolving all that it touches." Now we're getting closer. Despite our frequent yet subconscious denial of the fact, every reflective person must concede that we will all die and that everything we care about perishes along with us. The Buddha repeatedly warns of our inescapable destiny, which is old age, sickness, and death. Indeed, the largest sutra points out that in the midst of worldly desires and attachments, one comes and goes alone, is born alone, and dies alone. This is the predicament the Dharma seeks to address. It's true that many are content with an agreeably pedestrian existence that is not preoccupied with religious concerns at any deep level. Indeed, ultimate questions about life and death don't feature prominently in their day-to-day routines, which are often quite pleasant and comfortable. However, usually when one least expects it, life can throw us a tragic curveball which may find us completely unprepared, spiritually speaking. When this happens, more intensive resources are required to tackle a crisis of such magnitude. This is where a fully orthodox teaching is crucial to helping restore shattered lives through an encounter with something that is immune to the devastating fluctuations of fortune. In my 30 years of pastoral experience, I have found that when Jodo Shinshu is not grounded in a strong traditional perspective, it will let people down to the extent that it settles for a solution at the same unreliable level of reality as the adversity itself. If you believe that the goal of the Dharma is simply to improve society, however you envisage that, or to help us become our best selves, whatever that may look like, then you might be in the wrong tradition, seeing as you'll just end up having your expectations dashed. This is because the ruthless cycle of transmigration is steeped in travail, dissatisfaction, and impermanence. Nothing stays the same, and everything soon passes away. Furthermore, we are beings afflicted by the three poisons of greed, anger, and folly, with minds full of snakes and scorpions, as Shinran laments. This is the unsettling shadow that hangs over all of us. Here is where the Buddhist teachings come to the fore, if we have ears to hear, as they teach that no temporal solution to the problem can be found. Of course, admitting as much doesn't justify rejecting efforts to ameliorate the world's burdensome conditions. This can certainly be done, despite the tendency of unwise human interference to also aggravate our difficulties. Both pessimism and optimism are out of place here. Our only objective is to discover how things really are. The chronicles of life are strewn with the debris of blood-soaked utopias, which have only succeeded in redistributing human misery. And the eminent historian Edward Gibbon remarked that history is little more than the register of the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind. Despite efforts by big tech billionaires to fund AI technology that will somehow give us a digital elixir of immortality, such desperate measures will prove to be in vain, given the inherently unstable conditions of samsara. The Buddha's famous fire sermon doesn't pull any punches. In it we read, "O monks, everything is burning." With what is it burning? It is burning with the fire of passion, the fire of hatred, the fire of delusion. I declare that it is burning with the fire of birth, decay, death, grief, lamentation, pain, sorrow, and despair. As might be expected, this is hardly what people want to hear. Over 50 years ago, Chokyam Trungpa spoke of, quote, the neurotic pursuit of physical comfort and security. He said that our highly organised and technological society reflects a preoccupation with manipulating physical surroundings so as to shield ourselves from the irritations of the raw, rugged, unpredictable aspects of life. Push-button elevators, pre-packaged meat, air conditioning, flush toilets, retirement programs, mass production, weather satellites, bulldozers, fluorescent lighting, 9-to-5 jobs, television, all are attempts to create a manageable, safe, and pleasurable world. He also noted that we adopt concepts as filters to screen us from the direct perception of what is, using them as tools to solidify the world and ourselves. However, all this busy and often anxious striving is but palliative in nature and doomed to fail because it's a futile defense against an annihilation perceived as unstoppable. We fear the loss of our fragile identities, shaped by conventional yet often false notions, which are thought to protect us from the precarious twists of fate and the cruel finality of death. Everything we do along these lines is a battle to find a place of unchanging rest in a hostile world that appears to be constantly working against us and our interests. Yet it's precisely an oasis of spiritual repose that the Buddhist path makes available, though it does so by pointing in the only right direction. A disconcerting fact about us is that we seem to need villains in our lives, against whom we can vent our antipathy and indignation, which, not surprisingly, are considered completely pardonable because we alone are seen to be on the side of the angels. Thus, double standards prevail everywhere we turn. By carefully maintaining an idealised version of ourselves, we aim to prop up our vanity, which serves to make us feel good about who we are. By sanctifying our own desires, we demonise those who don't conform to them. As a result, the larger sutra says that we entertain venomous thoughts, creating a widespread, dismal atmosphere of malevolence. Needless to say, these are not behaviours consistent with the Dharma, as they only lead to resentment and unhappiness. So what do all these depressing facts have to do with orthodoxy? Well, everything, insofar as only a right view on these matters can alleviate our troubled minds and our agitated hearts. This condition describes all of us, without exception, when we are cut off from the true and real, as we say in Jodo Shinshu. That being so, the importance of having a clear apprehension of our perilous lives becomes crucial in negotiating a safe passage through this burning house of a world with all its lies and gibberish, to use the unsparing words of Shinran. Buddhist teachings are confronting and ought to make us feel uncomfortable. If all they do is confirm you in your intolerance, gently stroke your ego and fuel an inflated sense of personal virtue, then they aren't doing their job. As Gesho Sasaki stated over a century ago, Jodo Shinshu is not a religion of goodness, but a religion of truth. The problem is that we don't really see our ugly self-righteousness, not to mention the insatiable thirst that fretfully clings to momentary satisfactions in order to have us forget the desolation that haunts our unillumined lives. As the Buddha once observed, a slave to craving is subject to sorrow. We sanitize the unpleasantness of life so that the underlying dread that we feel in the face of life's harsh truths is largely concealed. Accordingly, we overlook the fact that we regularly find fault in others and ignore how disgruntled we become when things don't go our way. In fact, Shinran offers the rather somber reflection that our desires are countless and wrath, jealousy and envy are overwhelming, arising without pause to the very last moment of life. They do not cease or disappear or exhaust themselves. So when hearing the Buddha tell us that we're all plagued by the three poisons, we may be disinclined to believe that we ourselves actually suffer from this illness. But if we're smugly satisfied with our own wisdom and by what we take to be our moral decency, then we are effectively saying that his teachings are somehow mistaken, inasmuch as they're sobering truths. Inasmuch as they're sobering truths regarding what we're really like, simply don't apply to us. If you fail to recognize in yourself the very problems that Buddhism claims to solve, then there's no basis for a credible commitment to the Dharma, because penetrating self-awareness will be absent. And why would you want this anyway when you think that you're already a perfectly fine and upstanding individual? Don't get me wrong, this is not about promoting self-condemnation. Rather, we are urged to reflect on ourselves objectively in the mirror of a higher wisdom, which is a way of seeing things clearly by means of a transcendent insight or prajna that is kindled by the arising of Shinjin. We all desire to get along without conflict and aggression, but no socio-political strategy will ever yield such an outcome. The world's problems cannot be addressed unless we first resolve them as they exist in us. In other words, there's no prospect of deliverance if we rely on the degraded conditions in which we are immersed. Candid Buddhists need to readily admit that being hopelessly caught in the quagmire of greed, anger and folly, they require urgent treatment to recover from this infirmity just like everybody else. The practice of deep hearing, Mompo, is made possible when we come to see that we're all vulnerable to the disease the Buddha was talking about. If you are convinced that you're entirely healthy, then you'll ignore the cure. But there can't be a proper spiritual aspiration without an open mind that's prepared to acknowledge that we are regularly selfish and insensitive. Indeed, as a result of the good opinion that we have of ourselves, we are rarely prepared to admit our own complicity in the very circumstances that cause us so much grief. To help us deal with this painful truth that we dare not acknowledge, we project our own viciousness onto those we view as enemies, who are then attacked with malice, rather than being embraced as fellow victims of the very same ailment that easily turns us both into haters. The basis of Jodo Shinshu is a declaration of spiritual facts that serve to unmask our chaotic subjectivity and challenge the flattering view we often have of ourselves. They grant us an incisive perceptiveness that won't be found in either our clever thoughts or admirable sentiments. Renyo says that faith does not arise from within oneself, the entrusting heart is given by the other power. The only thing left for us to do then is expose a mind that is dark and a heart that is corrupted to a meter's searing luminosity. We most certainly do not bring our own wisdom and goodness to the table, for these are not conducive to thoroughgoing regeneration, as they are but counterfeits for real virtue. To the extent that we are drawn into the immeasurable light and life that suffuses the 10 quarters of the universe, we become truly authentic as individuals, despite our brokenness. Conventional notions may assist in managing our functional responsibilities in life, but they don't help to clarify what is being unveiled to us. The sutras are not concerned with the workaday domain of daily existence, except with a view to transforming our responses to it. Furthermore, their teachings aren't founded on what is just rational, though neither do they violate the rules that govern coherent thought. Okay, so neither is it irrational. The writings of our tradition are sacred. Why? Because they comprise a meter's revelation to beings in distress. They have no interest in promoting ideas, which only lead to contention and disputes anyway. For their words convey the initiative of the transcendent in the midst of everyday life, which is what makes the Dharma come alive in our hearts. Inspired teachings help us to see the active dimension of ultimate reality itself, opening up in ordinary people as Shinjin. This is something that's beyond mere belief or unbelief, okay, which are always subject to doubt, because it's a truth that can be tasted and thus immediately known as a contemplative serenity that dawns on us in moments of endowed illumination. Such realization cannot be fabricated by external events or emotional states, inasmuch as we're invited to come under the forceful sway of a Buddha-centered influence that exceeds our flawed designs. This is known as hearing the call of the vow, which is the dynamic aspect of this reality reaching out to us in the form of an enticing summons to surrender our entire being along with our oppressive karmic baggage to its purifying activity. When that takes place, our way of being in the world undergoes a radical metamorphosis, something that our blind reactions to everyday predicaments are unable to produce. This is because the Tathagata imparts a fullness of life that quenches our inflamed passion for worldliness and releases us from the repugnant terror of existential emptiness. Until then, we struggle to dominate our circumstances and other people so that we might feel as though we're in charge of our lives, convinced that everything is going well for us. But you cannot be happy by adjusting the conditions of the world to suit your desires. This is a fool's errand, as you'll only end up being hurt and frustrated. Because so much of what happens in life is beyond your ability to manipulate. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught that it's not in our control to have everything turn out exactly as we want, but it is within our power to govern how we respond to what happens. Hence, the problem lies with us. The Dharma does not afford protection from life's assaults, although it is uniquely placed to relieve our disturbance in relation to them. In this way, Jodo Shinshu holds out the promise of an interior freedom while giving rest and comfort to the vexed condition of the human heart. This is the healing light of Amida, a spiritual sun that's constantly shining and drawing us to itself. When we bask in its warmth, we are bestowed with a tranquil awareness, also known as anjin, that remains steadfast even in the throes of everyday tempests. The essence of reality, therefore, is a wisdom compassion that measures us by showing how unloving and ignorant we often are. Yes, a tough truth to take in, but one that cannot possibly be seen by means of ordinary introspection. We have here an approachable but profound teaching that can reach anyone who is sincere, receptive, and hungry for a truth that is liberating. According to Shinran, its fundamental intent is solely to teach the inconceivable vow of Amida, whereby foolish beings, ever floundering in birth and death, realize supreme Shinjin and attain great joy, so that without being made to sunder blind passions, they are brought quickly to the realization of great nirvana. That's the teaching. People are always seeking respite from their disquiet, looking for answers from a host of ideologies that tantalize us with the prospect of a better world. However, these options offer an unsteady basis for human flourishing. For example, in judging others harshly according to, say, their political opinions, we will invariably lose our compassion and develop contempt for them. When we take sides and become prisoners of an implacable bigotry, we then take sides and become prisoners of that kind of bigotry. Hatred is thus justified as a virtue, and so we remain divided. Inevitably, this will incite ignorant armies that clash by night, in the memorable words of the English poet Matthew Arnold. Much of our psychology as human beings is wrongly fortified by our resistance to mortality. We are driven to erect safeguards against this hidden fear by standing out in the world through various achievements, causes, and passions, so as to give our lives some significance in the face of the yawning abyss that we believe awaits us. In his great work, The Denial of Death, Ernest Becker called these our immortality projects. We are also held captive by the four great fixations of life: power, status, money, and pleasure. Yet, should the emotional reinforcements of our self-preservation ever be threatened, we may react with rage, panic, or desperation as the supports that give our lives a sense of purpose are mercilessly pulled out from under us. We want to create a paradise on earth because we've denied the existence of something greater that does not pass away like everything else. One can certainly appreciate in such efforts a spirit of generosity, whereby we seek to benefit materially and spiritually both others and ourselves in this life. Of course. Nevertheless, our eternal Buddha nature, that dimension of the Dharma body that dwells equally in all beings, yearns for more than just a one-dimensional life. So, as long as we're not grounded in the unchanging truth it represents, we'll end up instead chasing after new and equally flimsy utopian fairylands of sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows, to quote a popular song from the 1960s, which some of you may remember. We are always trying to fill the spiritual void in our existence with spurious substitutes. This is the tragedy of the human condition, to which a life of Nembutsu offers a compelling resolution. Okay, enough of setting the scene. So let's return to the importance of having a sturdy conception of Jodo Shinshu, without which there can be no legitimate orthodoxy. Many people are put off by this word, as it brings to mind rigid fundamentalists and narrow-minded zealots who think they alone possess the truth. And yet, outside the sphere of religion, we see people tenaciously clutching to a plethora, to all manner of orthodoxies in every sphere of life, from politics and economics to social causes and cultural issues. So why is orthodoxy permitted in other fields of human endeavour, where it's often brutally enforced, by the way, but not with respect to spiritual beliefs? So let us embrace this term without apology and explore its implications for our tradition. It goes without saying that there is unquestionably an orthodox basis to Jodo Shinshu, and that is, of course, the writings of Shinran, whose custodians have preserved and passed it down over the centuries with great fidelity. We also have the great jewel that is the collected works of the Shonen in English, which is accompanied by deeply impressive commentarial material that imparts much clarity to the master's insights for audiences today. Authority is another word that is frowned upon these days, but in religious discourse, it's indispensable. If there are no trustworthy guides considered integral to a just appraisal of our tradition, then we're left with as many interpretations as there are individuals, with no means of adjudication. Until quite recently, this was considered obvious enough, but now it seems that almost everything is up for grabs. If the excesses of such relativism remain unchecked, our thinking will become even more confused, and the Dharma will fail to take root in us as a new mind of awareness and a new heart of loving kindness. A fish rots from the head, as they say. So if our doctrinal foundations are crumbling, then the tradition is in peril. One example that keeps coming up is the claim that the Pure Land does not represent any kind of higher reality, but is just a lifeless metaphor that we use to give us comfort in the face of life's vicissitudes, which then acts as a spur for us to create, often compulsively, ideal communities in the world, as mentioned earlier. But such a view reflects a completely secularized understanding of the Dharma and is indisputably heterodox. In the largest sutra, by contrast, we read that the Pure Land is, quote, vast in extent, unsurpassed, and supremely wonderful, always present and subject to neither decay or change. In other words, nirvana itself. A notable difference in outlook, to say the least. As a result, some contend that the masters of our tradition could not have meant what they appear to say about higher realities or the next life. So they must have really been talking about something more down to earth. I was once shocked to hear a minister assert that we ought to regard Honen, Shinran and Renyo as products of a medieval mindset, who expressed themselves imprecisely because they lacked access to whatever current yet passing intellectual fads happen to be in vogue right now. So the claim goes, if those sages had lived among us today, they would have benefited from our more advanced ideas and thus might well have thought exactly as we do. The hubris of that remark left me speechless and demonstrated that such misplaced self-assurance was in fact but the expression of this person's own skepticism and uncertainty. As though they were saying, if I don't see it, then it can't possibly be true or worth knowing. This is what's captured by the Japanese Buddhist term ma-yoi, which we don't often come across in our tradition. It is similar to mumyo, darkness of mind, but it evokes a broader range of suggestive meanings: hesitation, bafflement, indecision, and perplexity. It also means to waver, lose one's way, or be blinded by emotion. Shinran called it the long night of ignorance, in which we look upon our ever-changing phenomenal world as the only reality there is. Yet the Dharma reveals that to be the deceptive consensus of unenlightened beings, marked as it is by the widespread unease, fear, and loneliness that we see among so many people right now. Socrates argued that there is only one good, namely knowledge, and one evil, which is ignorance. People inflict torment on others and themselves because they have a distorted notion of where the true good lies. Our current preoccupation with identity issues, for example, is arguably an external means of dealing with a largely repressed alienation that reflects a deep crisis regarding who we are. The Buddha would have surely condemned any obsession with imagined selves given the inner turmoil to which it gives rise, while offering a potent countermeasure in his doctrine of anatta, in which he robustly dismantles mistaken conceptions of selfhood. Now, it's one thing for someone to harbour a strictly personal view about the nature of reality. Okay? No problem with that at all. But to have the temerity to pass this off as a valid interpretation of Pure Land thought is unacceptable when there's overwhelming evidence to the contrary. If up is said to be down, and black is affirmed as white, then we might as well throw in the towel, for there isn't much to salvage when all we're left with is a tepid, half-hearted Buddhism that lacks relevance. Others again emphatically deny that Amida is an all-permeating and suprapersonal reality that also transcends samsara. Yet Shinran teaches that Tathagata has emerged from the ocean of suchness to take form as the Dharma body of compassion for the sake of sentient beings, and that it pervades the countless worlds. Now, whether you like it or not, that is the correct Jodo Shinshu position. To retort that this is just an outmoded way of thinking, because many scientists tell us that there is nothing other than flux and impermanence, is barely convincing. Science has no competence in relation to what is immaterial. And in any case, the Buddhist tradition explicitly declares that there is a reality which is both unconditioned, asamskata, and transmundane, lokotara. In other words, not subject to dependent co-origination. This was directly confirmed by the Buddha himself and also perceived by a host of sages after him. So what do I mean by suprapersonal? Many Western Buddhists today feel very uncomfortable with this kind of language. Having renounced Christianity, they reject anything that smacks of its outlook, but in doing so, they have thrown out the baby with the bathwater, largely out of ill will. One can certainly understand the abhorrence that is felt by certain descriptions of God, such as Yahweh in the Old Testament, that evoke a being that is wrathful, capricious, and destructive. But the way around this problem is not to abandon the notion of personhood altogether, because this is something of inestimable value to human beings. What I mean is that the Tathagata can be considered in a way that's purified of the major stumbling blocks that we find in some forms of theistic belief. Now, I appreciate that D.T. Suzuki is controversial and that he may have had some idiosyncratic views about Pure Land Buddhism, but he did occasionally reveal flashes of great insight. The following statement may still be a bridge too far for many of you, but it is worth pondering its implications for how we might envisage Amida as a compassionate disclosure of the Dharma body as suchness, Hosho Hoshin. He says, the highest reality is not a mere abstraction. It is very much alive with sense and intelligence, and above all, with love purged of human infirmities and defilements. Clearly, this is not describing something impersonal, but rather a presence that is the very perfection of personhood, shorn of all defects. If we cannot accept this, then we fail to do justice to the traditional language found in Jodo Shinshu. Indeed, it is incoherent to speak of anything having compassion towards us by raising vows intended for our liberation if it is bereft of an affective dimension. Not effective, affective as in relating to our affections. After all, to be compassionate means to stand alongside the suffering of another. This is undoubtedly a supremely personal act, not just a symbol. Anyway, of what exactly would this be a symbol? Some kind of non-personal energy, like the law of gravity? Is that what we're trying to say here? I'm not sure that this is in any way plausible. A reality that moves us to leap and dance with joy and which causes a good mind to arise, as the larger sutra declares, cannot by any stretch of the imagination, as far as I'm concerned, be prompted by anything other than that which wills the highest good for us. And for those out there who are still avowed materialists, we are not emphatically talking about blind matter here, or a random cosmic force that has as much regard for you as an iceberg. Our school teaches that a person has the potential to become an enlightened being who is eminently sentient, right? And that we're subject to a timelessly benevolent exertion that turns bits of rubble into gold, not into mere oblivion. Surely a great spiritual treasure is what's being suggested here by the reference to gold, not the fruits of mere cerebral analysis. To insist otherwise is simply disingenuous. So we can see that Amida, as the Dharma body of compassion, is an expression of that which is formless, ineffable and unthinkable. But what's remarkable about this manifestation is that the form that's been assumed in order to reach out to lost and wayward mortals like us is one that strictly corresponds to our needs as human persons. Accordingly, that from which the vows have emerged can hardly be less than personal, because you can't give what you don't have. Therefore, we should not confuse this with a crude anthropomorphism, which it most certainly isn't. That is why the venerated story of Dharmakara Bodhisattva is so significant. While many cannot bring themselves to accept this as an account of historic events, what this narrative undeniably does convey are universal spiritual certitudes of a most compelling nature, namely the fundamental desire of ultimate reality to bring us back to itself. It would be absurd to suggest that the sutra's moving account of divine compassion is but an allegory for mere wishful thinking on our part. It's only comprehensible when seen as a salvific initiative from the far shore, one that soothes and gladdens our spirits and fulfills the quest for an ultimate meaning that is not constrained by this twilight world of fugitive appearances. Some will say that this story gives the impression of being personal only because we perceive it through the limited cognitive faculties of a human being. But it is clearly taught, and we're also able to confirm it for ourselves, that we are recipients of a wisdom compassion that does not have its genesis in us. Which means that the endowment of these qualities is a willed act initiated by other power that consciously engages in skillful means intended for our greatest benefit. Hence the common experience that many have had of Amida as Oyasama, or an honoured parent. How else can we make sense of what our sacred texts are plainly telling us? Therefore, I urge you to remain wary of the strange love affair that many have with this barren impersonalism. It's a spiritual dead end in which there is no hope whatsoever. It is time to get over our inferiority complex as followers of Shinran's teachings and to celebrate what is truly splendid and unique about them. If we lose sight of what's distinctive in our tradition, then we'll have nothing special to share with the world. So let's stop pretending that we're second-rate imitators of other Buddhist schools, because they certainly don't lack the self-confidence that we do. Another unfortunate misconception is when we hear that the essence of Jodo Shinshu is little more than a life of gratitude. You hear that all the time, right? Not to the Tathagata, mind you, but towards others and to the causes and conditions that make life on this planet possible. Of course, we ought to be thankful for those things that support our existence. But this is not what Shinran and Renyo meant by gratitude, which for them had a completely spiritual focus. And let's not forget that for many people today, the karmic circumstances that have led to life in this world have been utterly horrific. So we need to be careful when we adopt a secular interpretation of what it means to be grateful. People who are hurting deeply are looking for permanent solutions, not short-lived panaceas, precisely because this fickle world has left them with very little to hope for. In our tradition, gratitude is quite evidently an appreciation for the primal vow of Amida and for the conditions that have led us to the Pure Land path. Professor Perry Schmidt-Lukel remarks that Buddhism today can come across as, quote, an easy pop religion, a spirituality without dogmas or beliefs, without precepts or commandments, always peaceful and tolerant of almost everything. Or as no religion at all, but rather a form of wisdom psychology, a lifestyle or trendy worldview, most appropriate for the slightly weary but well-heeled postmodern intellectual. Perhaps these observations have now become cliches, but they're still not that far from the truth. It is a melancholy fact that many who think in this way simply don't get what Jodo Shinshu is telling us. Because they can't see that the Dharma, as an early Pali text declares, goes against the worldly stream and is unattainable by mere reasoning. What we observe here is a serious blind spot that fails to discern the vividness of spiritual realities, to which lay people, most refreshingly, are often much more attuned than some of our intelligentsia. One recalls Hornen's rather dim view of faithless scholars, for example. But this is how we end up with untenable notions such as Amida Buddha is nothing but X. The Pure Land is nothing but Y. This always involves a downgrade, whereby these substitutes invariably become less than what the tradition insists they are. Rather than rising to the level of transcendental truth, we succumb to a pernicious reductionism in which the vertical dimension of existence is collapsed into a purely horizontal one, a flatness. This confines reality to our own limitations, which leads us to believe whatever happens to be convenient and where words mean anything we want them to. And yet, in the foreword to the Tanisho, we receive the unambiguous message that nobody should defile the doctrine of other power with their own arbitrary interpretations. Perhaps this is a forlorn hope, but it needs to be said anyway. Instead, we now hear that the true and real is just another way of thinking about this vague oneness that we share with humanity at large, envisaged as scarcely more than an empathetic solidarity. In that case, let me ask you this. Do we feel at one with those we consider to be our adversaries, regardless of spiritual or ideological persuasion? I very much doubt it. For human nature is such that we are decidedly more partial to those who share our values. Nonetheless, we're taught that only the Tathagata receives all beings equally. This alone is true inclusivity. The synopsis of the Jodo Shinshu Creed from 1922, yeah, I'm a bit old school. A wonderful work, by the way, and hard to find. It states, Amida is absolute compassion that in conformity with the truth breaks down obstinate selfishness and loves ignorant and bewildered people equally and universally without any distinction of person. So the question is, are we able to practice what we preach, or do we just give lip service to this ideal? Without an awareness of a higher reality that unites and imbues all beings, any talk of interconnectedness is hollow, because even our most despised opponents possess an immense dignity in that they, no less than us, are beneficiaries of a great vow that envelops every person while abandoning none. We are currently witness to the teaching being relentlessly disfigured so that it's made to conform to the spirit of the age, because it is claimed we are now more sophisticated than our forebears. Therefore, we need to improve their understanding and bring it up to date. Extraordinary arrogance, to say the least. And what is so special about our times anyway? Such that we can justify compromising the Dharma and cutting it down to size, which I see happen all the time. So rather than approach the rich wisdom of these sublime doctrines with reverence and humility by taking them at face value, we cynically trash whatever doesn't satisfy our preconceptions, which is often done, I have to say, with a certain measure of secret bitterness against any sincere religious aspiration, just because it cannot be found in us. But if there is no love of the traditional teachings, if we really find them so embarrassing or repellent, then why remain in Jodo Shinshu? What possible benefit could be gained if none of it is real to us? Why not just discard this pretense altogether? That would be the honest thing to do, rather than trying to appropriate the Dharma to our own ends, which are often the very antithesis of what has been taught for centuries. Those who don't share Shinran's vision need to seriously consider finding a home elsewhere, if for no other reason than to maintain their personal integrity. One doesn't just join our Sangha because we're looking for an easygoing community that it welcomes everyone, or because no meditation or austerities are required. Shallow reasons such as these aren't good enough and only serve to debase the currency of the teachings, leaving us with just an exotic cultural club. The fact of Amida coming alive in our hearts and minds as a living presence is core to our faith and thus non-negotiable. Any teacher who repudiates this foundational truth is misleading people and destroying the very pillars of our tradition. We must stand up against this vandalism. You see, it takes no real intelligence, creativity, or imagination to tear things down. A sneering animosity is perfectly sufficient. But what do you do once you've demolished that which is irreplaceable? Many don't know the answer because they appear not to be troubled by this question in the first place. And let us not forget that such was his resolute commitment to orthodoxy that Shinran himself felt compelled to repudiate his own son for spreading heretical ideas among the followers in the Kanto region. Only by taking such drastic and personally painful measures were the true teachings able to be restored and accepted with confidence once again. So rather than questioning their own assumptions, a number of people prefer instead to criticise the Dharma as it has been received. They see its pre-modern mentality as being a problem because it's failed to conform to how many think today. But this is to put the cart before the horse, okay? Rest assured, though, that anyone who has become enlivened by the mind of the Tathagata would never belittle these time-honoured teachings in such an egregious manner because, as I think Yoshifumi Ueda once said, the person of Shinjin is nothing but the manifestation of Amida's work. Indeed, the primacy of Shinjin is seldom mentioned or understood these days. This bedrock realisation on which everything else hangs is practically ignored because it evidently hasn't awakened in us. Referring to a principle invoked earlier, you can't impart to others what you yourself don't possess, in which case this jubilant truth will never be transmitted faithfully to those who are in need of it. One of the reasons why Renyo was considered the second founder of Jodo Shinshu was precisely because he restored Shinjin to the heart of our tradition and its concerns, making it accessible to ordinary folk. The same rehabilitation is needed now. But how is this to be done? By returning to the well springs of our faith, by which I mean not just the study of traditional writings, but a renewed appreciation of them through a momentous encounter with the very source of their revelation, the unity of Bombu and Amida's mind. While this cannot be a strict Zen-like identity, it remains an unshakable union known as Kiho Itai. This that leads to the joyous stage of non-retrogression in this life and to final emancipation when nirvana is attained at death. Unless the primal vow provokes a transformative breakthrough in our lives, all we're left with are just words in old texts that speak of arcane things that our minds no longer find intelligible. But if that's how we really feel about the teachings, we must have the courage to ask, is it possible that I may be at fault? Can all these extraordinary witnesses to spiritual truth over 2,000 years have been so mistaken, deluded, or mendacious, and that we alone have got it right today? Why assume that certain fashionable attitudes, prominent in the West for only a rather short period of history, are the sole arbiter of a vast and powerful vision of reality that has stood the test of time and outlasted every ideology the world has ever known? Thanks to the Pure Land Masters, we have received a precious spiritual inheritance that brings a persistent joy and well-being to our lives, so long as it isn't willfully misconstructed or reinvented in the interests of profane agendas, bankrupt dogmas, or a corrosive materialism that sees a human being as little more than a bag of chemicals. We are hardwired for spiritual truths, which means that our longing for true light and life can only be fulfilled by an immeasurable reality that surpasses this ephemeral existence. The larger sutra states, if sentient beings encounter the Buddha's light, their defilements are removed. They feel tenderness, joy, and pleasure, and good thoughts arise. If sentient beings in the realm of suffering see this light, they will be relieved and freed from affliction. At the end of their lives, they all reach emancipation. Deep listening, without any calculation or scheming on our side, exposes our minds to the beneficent action of the vow, which endows us with fresh eyes of wisdom that fully uncover our disordered passions, thus allowing us to become soft and gentle in body and mind, to quote the 33rd vow. This in turn leads to a spontaneous impulse to engage in wholesome and virtuous behaviour despite our shortcomings, prompted by the natural consequence of being bathed in the Tathagata's light of purity, Shojoko. In one of his famous letters, Shinran describes this far-reaching transformation as follows. Formerly, you were drunk with the wine of ignorance and had a liking only for greed, anger, and folly. But since you have begun to hear of the Buddha's vow, you have gradually awakened from the intoxication of ignorance, gradually rejected the three poisons, and have come to prefer at all times the medicine of Amida Buddha. In people who have long heard the Buddha's name and said the Nembutsu, surely there are signs of rejecting the evil of this world and signs of the desire to cast off the evil in themselves. This is why the Dharma must be defended for the sake of future generations. For how can you become vivified by Amida's working if you're never told about it? That is the crucial function of orthodoxy. So when it comes to the pressing matter of our final release from the round of birth and death, which, alas, many don't even take seriously anymore, it's simply not true that all views are equally valid or uniformly sound. There is too much at stake here to allow the nonsense of an unhinged relativism to gain the upper hand, for in that case, the downward slide into a banal and anemic mediocrity becomes inevitable. People have always sought a deeper solace than what ordinary life can give them. What are the signs that this may not be enough? Unfulfilled yearning, unexplainable angst, aching boredom, incessant restlessness, and a persistent disenchantment. Which is to say that what the world initially promised us has failed to deliver. Yet even this recognition is already the dawning of spiritual maturity. Edward Conze, the renowned scholar of Indian Mahayana, makes the following important point. The Buddhist seeks for a total happiness beyond this world. But why should they be so ambitious? Why not be content with getting as much happiness out of this world as we can, however little it may be? The answer is that in actual practice, we are not seen to be satisfied. Our human nature is so constituted that we are content with nothing but complete permanence, complete ease, and complete security. And none of that can we ever find in this shifting world. So, how can our spiritual inclinations be properly nourished when we no longer talk about transcendence? The Nirvana Sutra, which was much beloved by Shinran, unequivocally affirms that the unborn is eternity, bliss, true self, and purity, and forever free of all birth, aging, sickness, and death. Do you find anything in this fleeting world that remotely corresponds to that description? But we also need the perspective of immanence, which is necessary for a healthy spiritual equilibrium. In other words, unless the compassionate intrusion of the Tathagata is welcomed into the midst of our turbulent lives as something wondrously visceral, then we'll continue to bear without relief the hardship of this burning house, whose very nature is to be transient, uncertain, and fraught with danger. So my advice is, turn away from much of the commonplace thinking that we find in this world and let the Dharma do the work of bringing you home. Relinquish all suffocating pride as you cast your naked and unadorned self before the great compassion that seeks to free you from the snares of an inauthentic life. True understanding is something you receive. It is not created by us, so we must be shown it. You cannot think your way to this realization. One can only reason from the working of the vow, not to it, because it is grounded in a glorious vision, not a sterile argument. In light of this wisdom, which can only ever be conferred, what's made known to us is the false life that we're frequently lost in, and the sea of confusion in which we often find ourselves drowning. We seek happiness in this Saha world of endurance, yet such a fractured realm is not perfectible and cannot grant anything that is genuinely reliable. Indeed, the larger sutra bemoans that outflows of depravity and defilement are everywhere, and there is nothing in which you can find true joy. We are all oppressed by binding desires and trapped in the ever-spinning hamster wheel of human existence, tossed about by customary notions of good and bad, right and wrong, happy and sad. The teaching then is difficult not in terms of what you have to achieve, but of what you need to let go. When deprived of Amita's radiance, we come to feel the misery of our empty hearts. The Tathagata knows this unvarnished truth about us and offers an antidote. This means that we must give our scriptures the benefit of the doubt and suspend judgment pending discovery, because the awakening of which the Dharma speaks needs to be verified existentially. We have to discern what the tradition is telling us without adulterating it. Otherwise, our hearts will remain hardened and bound to their past conditioning. What we witness today is a growing propensity to ignore, or worse, cheapen the wisdom bequeathed to us by Jodo Shinshu. Yet its exalted vision offers a trustworthy path that can steer us through the brambles and thorns, as Shinran described wrong views when they have become rampant. Do we see any appetite for defending orthodoxy these days? Or is it just a cacophony of personal perspectives fueled by our egos and their dogged preferences? Only a teaching with veracity can resist this spiritual malaise, because a defective exegesis will fail to confront the fundamental problem faced by human beings. The Tanisha was written with the singular aim of combating the doctrinal aberrations of its time, during which things had gone off the rails, as they have once again, albeit in novel ways that would have greatly dismayed the shonen. Ultimately, Jodo Shinshu reveals the universal significance of the 18th vow, which is like a torrent of refreshing rainfall following a long drought. The final consummation of our true hankering for liberation. From our side, we are surrounded by fury and shadows, whereas peace and illumination can be found only where the Buddha stands. Look at our unedifying culture wars, for example, all heat and no light. Under such conditions, as Shinran remarks, the use of violence and the poison of anger spread widely. A life of Monpo lays bare the piercing blaze of a higher truth. This is a form of surrender through hearing that needs to be front and centre of our lives. Only in a spirit of unreserved openness can we benefit from the exuberant wisdom of diamond-like Shinjin. This helps us to rise above the prevailing din of frenzied acrimony, discord and mistrust, so that we may behold the incandescence of Amida, in whom brightness reigns and there is no darkness, as we read in the Shoshinge. Once we know what the Tathagata is, the how of realization will answer itself naturally by means of the primal vow, without our fumbling and misguided contrivances. It ought to be clear by now that we don't require complex theories or advanced hermeneutics in order to make these teachings meaningful to our desacralized age. Faith alone is enough to see us through. So what is this? Well, Shinran tells us that it's to be set free from the shackles of self-power. But what does that mean? Well, he says that to relinquish the path of Jiriki is to abandon the conviction that one is good, to cease relying on the self, to stop reflecting knowingly on one's evil heart, and further to abandon the judging of people as good and bad. Shinran observes that we are spontaneously made to acquire this awareness when true and trusting arises within us. This life-changing realization, in which we also receive a distant foretaste of nirvana itself, is described by him as the mind full of truth, reality, and sincerity, the mind of ultimacy, accomplishment, reliance, and reverence, the mind of discernment, distinctness, clarity, and faithfulness, the mind of aspiration, desire, and exaltation, the mind of delight, joy, gladness, and happiness. Hence, it is completely untainted by the hindrance of doubt. Best definition of Shinjin you'll ever come across. Wonderful. So this is what Shinjin is, the mind that is given to us by Amida Buddha, not something generated by lost, foolish beings who, in the words of Shandao, are urgently seeking and urgently acting as though sweeping fire from their heads. So where exactly are we to find our spiritual haven? It is, to be sure, not in the world or among our fellow human beings, as no matter how much we may love either. In the Samyutta Nikaya, a famous Pali text, the Buddha himself urges us to rest in the peaceful, the deathless, the sublime, the auspicious, the secure, the destruction of craving, the wonderful, the amazing, the unailing, the shelter, and the unafflicted. Shinran corroborates this as follows. Nirvana is called extinction of passions, the uncreated, peaceful happiness, eternal bliss, true reality, Dharma body, suchness, oneness, and Buddha nature, which fills the hearts and minds of the oceans of all beings. In Jodo Shinshu, this is what we understand the Pure Land to be. In its active dimension, which reaches out to a suffering humanity, the inconceivable Dharma body has taken form as the Tathagata, literally to come from suchness. This is the embodiment of a wisdom that's abidingly present, such that, according to Beatrice Lane Suzuki, wherever we see beauty, holiness, compassion, or love manifested in our world of ignorance and illusion, we can know that it is because Amida's light is shining through the darkness. I will conclude with a short passage from the Sutra of Salvation through the Perfect Enlightenment of Amida, Supreme Among Buddhas, in which we are given a resplendent glimpse of our sole, unfailing refuge. The light of Amida Buddha is luminous, wondrous, and surpassingly good. It is pleasing beyond compare and boundlessly excellent. Amida's light is pure, without the least defilement or diminution. It is superbly beautiful, 100 million times more brilliant than the sun and the moon. Among those that see it, there is none that does not come to possess a heart of compassion and rejoice. Thank you.